It was meant to be a simple voyage, sun-drenched seas, elegant company, and a whisper of luxury, but no one imagined that someone had already died in cabin 13, and among the living someone was lying. The SS Nefertari had been slicing through the calm waters of the Mediterranean for 3 days, a glittering jewel adrift between Alexandria and London, when the first crack in the facade of order appeared, so subtle, so seemingly trivial, that none of us could have imagined it would end with Colonel Godfrey Rathmore dead in his cabin, and a priceless ceremonial dagger vanished without a trace. It all began with a man named Jonathan Blake, a wealthy and notably superstitious industrialist, who refused quite dramatically to occupy cabin 13. "I won't step into that cursed space," he had shouted, hands flailing in protest, sweat beading on his brow as the purser tried in vain to placate him. "It's not about comfort or class, it's about the number." Eventually, the purser relented, relocating Blake to a different cabin and assigning cabin 13 to none other than Colonel Rathmore, a stern, iron-faced veteran of the war, who laughed off the notion of curses and omens as bloody nonsense. I was traveling with Inspector Cyril Marlowe, an old friend and a man whose intuition had never failed him. We had come from Cairo, where Cyril had concluded a minor investigation at the British consulate, and I had joined him under the pretext of recovering from a bout of influenza, though in truth, I was simply restless and drawn to his peculiar magnetism for trouble. That evening, seated at the captain's table, we dined among an eclectic group, the aloof yet mesmerizing Elena Vasilis, whose olive-toned skin and guarded expressions hinted at long days under desert suns and longer nights tangled in secrets. Lady Imogen Faulkner, dripping with diamonds and entitlement, her voice was sharp as her gemstones. And of course the colonel and his young striking wife Evelyn, who spent the entire meal casting furtive glances at a handsome naval officer seated nearby. Conversation danced between pleasantries and veiled provocations, until the colonel, his voice steady with pride, revealed he had been gifted a ceremonial dagger by the Egyptian Minister of Antiquities, an ancient relic of gold and silver inlay, awarded for services rendered during the war. The room quieted, eyes turned sharp. Elena's fingers gripped her glass with such force I half expected it to shatter. "How fortunate," she murmured, but her tone betrayed anything but admiration. When Lady Imogen insisted on seeing the dagger, the colonel chuckled and waved the notion away. "Another time perhaps. I keep it locked away, one can't be too cautious at sea." Just then, the purser whispered something into the colonel's ear about a sudden plumbing issue, and with visible irritation, he excused himself to relocate, ironically to cabin 13, the very space Blake had abandoned in dread. "Superstition be damned," he scoffed upon return, brushing an invisible speck from his jacket. "I've braved German artillery, I think I can manage a number." But across the table Marlowe's eyes gleamed. That familiar spark, his little grey cells as he called them, had already begun their quiet work. Later, as we walked the outer deck, the ship swallowed in velvet darkness, he asked, "Did you see how Elena reacted to the dagger?" I nodded, noting also Evelyn's cold indifference to her husband's departure, and the way Lady Imogen seemed to measure everyone's worth against the weight of their jewelry. "Each of them," Cyril said quietly, "is carrying something heavy. Guilt maybe, jealousy, perhaps something worse." We both stared out at the endless sea, unaware that beneath its calm surface fate had already begun to churn. By morning Colonel Rathmore would be found dead, his throat slit, the dagger missing, and cabin 13, once again empty. But this was no ordinary theft, no simple crime of opportunity. It was a reckoning, a ghost risen from the desert sands, wrapped in centuries-old revenge, deception, and buried sin. And the killer, clever, patient and utterly remorseless, had only just begun. As we turned the corner of the lower deck, mid-conversation about the colonel's questionable war souvenirs, we nearly collided with a steward, a wiry, pale-faced man whose hands trembled slightly as he clutched a small leather valise, and a neatly folded officer's jacket, bearing Colonel Rathmore's insignia. "Pardon me, gentlemen," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the corridor as though afraid of being seen. "Just transferring the colonel's remaining belongings to his new cabin." Poirot's gaze narrowed, ever so subtly. "You're referring to cabin 13, yes?" The steward hesitated for half a heartbeat. "Yes, sir, just the last few things." He made to move past but paused, lifting his wrist with an embarrassed smile. Forgive me, but might either of you have the time? My watch appears to have stopped. Poirot retrieved his timepiece with his usual precision. It is exactly 9:27, he replied. The steward, Harkins, according to the slightly askew nameplate on his chest, murmured his thanks and vanished swiftly into the shadows of the hallway. We continued to the smoking room, where Captain Barton was enjoying a solitary cigar, his expression unreadable beneath a haze of smoke. You served with Colonel Rathmore, I believe? Poirot inquired gently. Barton's jaw tightened instantly. In Egypt, Palestine too. He commanded our regiment for a time. His voice held the dry weight of old scars. You were not close then? Poirot pressed. Barton exhaled slowly, tapping ash from his cigar. Let's just say our recollections of that campaign differ sharply. But it's all ancient history now, isn't it? Before Poirot could reply, the door burst open, and a steward, his face ghost white and his breath ragged, cried out, "Is there a doctor?" The colonel, he's been found, stabbed in his cabin. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, and I followed as we rushed toward the first-class quarters. Outside cabin, 133, a mere coincidence in number, or perhaps not. A cluster of onlookers had already gathered, their murmurs weaving a curtain of dread. The captain waved us through solemnly. Monsieur Poirot, this is deeply troubling. If you would. Of course, Captain, Poirot replied with grave politeness. The door creaked open to reveal chaos. A shattered water carafe glinting like crystal teeth on the floor, a chair on its side, bedclothes twisted as if someone had fought for their last breath, and there, sprawled grotesquely across the blood-soaked sheets, lay Colonel Rathmore, his expression frozen in startled disbelief. Protruding from his chest, like a grotesque exclamation mark, was the ceremonial dagger he'd boasted of the night before. Nothing to be done, the ship's doctor muttered grimly. He's been dead at least 30 minutes. Poirot's eyes swept the room with chilling calm, noting every detail. Who found him? I did, sir, came Harkins' now hoarse voice from the doorway, his complexion now a shade grayer than before. Came to ask if everything was satisfactory. Found him like that. Poirot studied him carefully. You touched nothing, only his wrist, to check. And the door handle. Poirot nodded and crouched near the bed, reaching beneath it and retrieving something I could not see, something he pocketed silently. We'll need to wireless ahead, the captain said, his voice hollow. Authorities will meet us at Moultrie, our next port. Then we have until tomorrow afternoon, Poirot said softly, to unravel what has been so violently tangled. You have full access, Monsieur Poirot, the captain assured. Everything, everyone, whatever you require. Outside the wind had risen, clouds now smothering the stars, thunder echoing distantly like the growl of something ancient stirring beneath the waves. Poirot's face had taken on that rare intensity I had only seen in the gravest of cases. The puzzle had revealed its first bloody edge, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until every hidden truth was unearthed from beneath the polished veneer of this drifting vessel. The ocean groaned beneath the SS Alexandria, its waves rising like ancient memories as a shroud of fog wrapped around the vessel, turning morning into a dim and watchful twilight. Within the first-class dining room, the mood was not merely somber, it was suffocating. The clinking of cutlery had grown hesitant, conversations reduced to breathless murmurs, and every face seemed to carry the weight of both curiosity and fear. I joined Inspector Lucien Marceau, whose presence radiated a cold, analytical calm, but even he was not immune to the chill that had settled over the ship, not from the sea air, but from the knowledge that a murderer moved among us. Note Madame Viramont, he said, his voice as quiet as a held breath. Across the room, the widow of the slain industrialist sat alone, cloaked in mourning black, her posture perfect, her coffee untouched, her face composed with the precision of a mask sculpted to conceal turmoil, or guilt. The grieving widow makes a public appearance, he murmured, when discretion would offer her sanctuary. Why expose one's sorrow, unless it serves a purpose? Before I could reply, Marceau's assistant, Miss Celeste Moreau, arrived like a whisper on the wind, her movements seamless, her eyes sharp. She placed 2 immaculately typed sheets beside the inspector, one listing the first-class passengers with cabin assignments and travel purposes, the other a log of crew members who had access to those corridors. Then with a nod she moved toward Madame Viramont, her instructions unspoken but clear, illicit truths where suspicion had planted seeds. Marceau, scanning the documents with swift efficiency, stood abruptly. There is someone whose nervousness intrigues me. Come. In the ship's quiet library, Alton Greaves sat ensnared in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on the grey restless sea beyond the rain-laced window, the book in his lap forgotten. He jolted as we entered, his fingers tangling nervously in a silk handkerchief marked with his initials. If I hadn't requested to switch cabins, he whispered, he would still be alive. His voice trembled under the weight of unearned guilt. Marceau leaned forward slightly. You feared cabin 17, didn't you? Greaves nodded, his lips trembling. My brother died in a hotel room, room 17, on the 17th of July at precisely 17 minutes past the hour. Since then the number haunts me like a curse. The inspector's gaze narrowed, dissecting the man's every twitch. And last night after dinner, I retired early. The motion of the ship unsettled me. Steward Perkins brought me a tonic. Around 9, I think. Marceau merely nodded and turned away, his thoughts veiled but precise. Fear often speaks louder than deceit, he muttered, as we exited. Our next stop took us above deck, where the wind roared like a caged beast, and rain began to needle the ship's surface. There we found Captain Delacroix, pacing beneath the grey canopy of an approaching storm, his boots thudding with tension, hands clasped tight behind his back. He turned as we approached, face drawn and wary. You've come then. I was expecting it, he said, his voice low and grim. Murder at sea is no ordinary crime, Inspector, it's a contagion. Panic spreads quicker than truth, and we're trapped in a floating cage. Marceau regarded him with an unreadable expression. Then we must act before fear does, he replied. Somewhere on this ship, beneath a smile, beneath a lie, the killer is watching. Perhaps seated just a few tables away from the widow, or whispering condolences with blood still drying on their conscience. Thunder rolled in the distance like an omen, and lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the fog-blanketed sea. A bell rang out from below, not for a meal, nor for safety, but as if echoing from some darker realm, a quiet chime heralding the beginning of a hunt. And as the inspector's eyes scanned the horizon, I understood. Every glance, every whisper, every polite gesture on this ship had now become a potential clue, a thread in the tapestry of murder, and the truth, however twisted, was drawing closer, inch by inch, wave by wave. The wind lashed across the upper deck like a living force, howling through the rigging and slapping against the slick railings, as Commander Victor Harland stood stoically at the edge, gazing into the fog-thick horizon when Inspector Duval appeared beside him. The brim of his hat pressed low against the rain-laced gusts. I presume this isn't a social call, Inspector, Harland said dryly, not turning. I suppose you're here to ask about the late Colonel Statham. Duval nodded slightly, leaning casually against the railing, unbothered by the cold spray that stung like needles against the skin. Last night you mentioned tensions between you and the Colonel. I'd appreciate more than vague implications. Harland exhaled hard, pulling a cigarette from a silver case, and shielding it from the wind with cupped hands, failing to light it twice before success. It was during the Eastern Campaign in Syria, he muttered, his voice hard and weathered. I commanded a midnight strike against a fortified ridge. High casualties, yes, but the mission succeeded. Brought back strategic documents, intercepted plans. But Statham, my superior at the time, rewrote the report to claim credit. He earned a medal and a promotion. I got a reprimand for acting recklessly. His voice cracked slightly with resentment. It was a betrayal in uniform. That would sting, Duval offered, watching him closely. But not quite enough for revenge, surely. Harland's fingers tightened around the rail, knuckles pale. If I were the sort to kill over old grudges, Inspector, I'd have run out of enemies years ago. Where were you last night between 9 and 10? Duval asked without missing a beat. Ship's gym until past, Harland replied, jaw clenched. Then the observation lounge. Ask Ensign Reed, he saw me there. Duval nodded once, his thoughts unreadable, and turned away. One more thing. Were you aware Statham had a rather valuable set of Phoenician relics in his possession? For the first time a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Harlan's face. Relics. I knew he collected trinkets like a crow, but nothing of value. They left him there, staring after them into the storm, and descended to the promenade deck where the wind softened, but the air remained taut with unease. In the ship's quiet writing room, they found Dr. Isadora Mavros, the sharp-eyed Greek archaeologist, poised mid-sentence over fine parchment. She set her pen down slowly as they approached, her gaze steady. "I've been expecting you," she said, her accent clipped, hands folding deliberately. "I imagine I am under suspicion." Duval smiled faintly. "Only gathering truths, Doctor. You knew the Colonel." Her eyes darkened. "He visited our excavation site in Luxor, took an interest in our unearthed statuary and scrolls, more than professional. When I refused his offer to acquire several items, he grew agitated." Her fingers drummed once on the desk. "Some artifacts vanished days later. No proof, but when he returned to London, I noticed pieces resembling ours displayed in private circles." Her voice remained calm, but a flush crept into her cheeks. "He was a man who disliked being told no." "And your whereabouts last night?" Duval asked. "In my cabin until 9, then the library. I remained there until lights out. Miss Anise saw me." As they walked back through the corridors of first class, the ship's polished wood and soft carpets felt like a muted maze of secrets. Duval whispered, "Two with motive, neither with proof, and both too composed," I added. "They don't feel like killers." Duval's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Then we must ask who among the guilty wears the most convincing innocence." Just then Miss Laurette, the purser's assistant, hurried from the main staircase, her usual calm replaced with urgency. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "you must hear what Mrs. Statham just told me. It's rather illuminating." Duval raised a brow, and gestured toward a nearby salon. "Then let us step somewhere private, Miss Laurette. I suspect what you're about to reveal may turn the tide of our entire investigation." As the ship's bell rang out, the chime hung in the air like a warning knell, and the storm beyond the hull seemed to grow darker, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. The Mediterranean had turned sullen, its waters no longer calm but heaving under a sky the color of decaying steel. The SS Calypso groaned as it cut through the restless waves, its once luxurious corridors now thick with an air of unease that no soft light or polished brass could disguise. Beneath the clinking glasses and polite smiles of the first-class deck, something far darker festered, a current of quiet malice, subtle as poison in wine. In the sanctuary of Cabin 9, far from the murmurs of the lounge, Poirot stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the room with an intensity that suggested he saw far more than the surface. Everything was precisely arranged, the armchair placed at an exact 45-degree angle from the writing desk, his travel brushes laid out as if ready for a surgeon's hand, and a lone orchid, its petals taut with life, rested in a narrow crystal vase. It was not just order, it was a temple of logic in a ship that now drifted amid chaos. Miss Thorne sat near the porthole, her posture as straight as a ruler, notebook balanced on her knees, fingers already poised to write. Not a hair out of place, not a crease in her slate-gray skirt. Her expression was unreadable, yet her eyes tracked everything. She spoke with the calmness of someone accustomed to observing storms from the eye of them. Mrs. Radley was more forthcoming than expected. She began quietly. Her marriage to the Colonel, she admitted, was based not on affection but on financial necessity. She didn't even flinch when I offered my condolences, simply waved a hand and asked how long she'd be detained in Malta, as if death were merely a delay. Poirot's brow furrowed, his fingertips brushing his waxed mustache thoughtfully. "And where does she go after Malta?" "Athens," Miss Thorne answered. "She claimed to have family there." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned slowly toward me. "Interesting, non? For our elegant archaeologist, Mademoiselle Calidora Petrolos, is also of Athenian origin. Might they have crossed paths before this voyage? Might there be history?" Before I could speak, A sharp, urgent knock came at the cabin door. Captain Miles entered, his cap tucked under one arm, but the strain of his news was etched into the lines of his face. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice clipped, "I thought you should know. We've conducted a preliminary inventory of Colonel Radley's belongings. His personal safe held a collection of ancient coins, Alexandrian tetradrach, many of considerable value. But there's a discrepancy. According to a note in his journal, there should have been 12. We found only 11. Poirot's eyes lit with that unmistakable gleam, part curiosity, part triumph, part something colder. A coin stolen perhaps, or hidden. Either way it has significance. Without hesitation we followed him back to cabin 13. The room was eerily silent, the bed stripped, the body removed, but an air of finality still clung to the corners. A steward stood watch just outside, but inside, it was just us and the scent of old tobacco and leather. Poirot moved through the space like a scholar reading sacred text, touching nothing, yet noticing everything. "You see, Hastings," he said softly, "it is never the grand gestures that reveal the truth, it is always the subtle betrayals." The overlooked. At the desk, a black leather folder lay slightly ajar. Inside, nestled in royal blue velvet, 11 silver coins gleamed beneath the lamplight. But one space remained empty, a dark void where the 12th coin should have been. "Curious," Poirot whispered. "Not stolen for wealth, I think, but removed for a reason." As he replaced the folder, something caught his eye beside the wastebasket. Using a handkerchief, he reached in and pulled out a torn piece of stiff card. He turned it slowly between his fingers. A playing card, ripped down the middle. Only half remained, bearing a portion of a red diamond and the letter K. "The King of Diamonds," I muttered. "But what does it mean?" Poirot stared at the fragment as if it were a cipher only he could read. "It means," he said, folding the card into an envelope, "we are no longer merely chasing a thief. We are dancing with a mind that wishes to be seen." Our next destination was the ship's museum, a quiet wood-paneled room with glass display cases that glinted under flickering lamps. Inside, Miss Petrolos stood alone, studying a centuries-old sextant as if it might hold the answers to everything. She turned slowly as we entered, her eyes cool and calm, yet something behind them flickered. Recognition, or perhaps caution. "Captain Hastings, Monsieur Poirot, have you made progress?" she asked, her voice silk-wrapped steel. Poirot offered her a polite smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "We pursue answers, mademoiselle. Tell me, did you know Mrs. Radley before this voyage?" For a split second, no more, something moved across her face. Surprise, guilt, memory. "No," she said slowly, "though now that you ask, I did see her once. In Athens, at the Numismatic Museum. She was with a man, perhaps the colonel, but we never spoke." "Yet you remembered her," Poirot said softly. "Curious, no, that a face seen only once should linger so long in your memory." Outside, thunder cracked in the distance, faint but growing. The ship creaked as if it too sensed the encroaching storm. And as the SS Calypso sailed deeper into the folds of a gathering darkness, so too did we sink further into a mystery woven, not just from lies and missing coins, but from something older, colder, and far more dangerous than we had anticipated. The storm had grown more insistent, lashing the hull of the SS Erebus like a living creature determined to tear through steel and certainty alike. Yet within the softly lit display room lined with ancient instruments of navigation, compasses once kissed by salt winds, bronze astrolabes that had charted forgotten oceans, Hercule Poirot remained unshaken, his silhouette a portrait of calm deduction. "Miss Eleni Dracu," he said with unsettling gentleness, his voice cutting through the room's fragile silence, "might I ask if you were previously acquainted with Mrs. Halbert?" Her manicured fingers, which had been delicately tracing the ornate etching on a worn Phoenician sextant, froze mid-gesture. Her eyes met his, controlled but not unreadable. "That's an oddly specific question, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice firm, though a tremor flickered beneath it like a cracked mirror behind polished glass. "Curiosity," he said, tilting his head. Of a professional nature, of course. A pause passed between them, tight, brittle, electric. Then she nodded with reluctant grace. We were not friends, no, but I knew her name. Our paths crossed often enough in scholarly journals and symposium programs. The world of Mediterranean antiquity is smaller than it appears, and sometimes colder. Poirot arched a brow. Yet you disclosed nothing of this to the authorities or the crew. Her reply came too quickly. It seemed irrelevant, but Poirot's gaze had already drifted to her right hand, now curled discreetly into the folds of her jacket. And do you play cards, Miss Dracul? The question dropped like a stone into still water. She inhaled sharply, a subtle stiffening betraying a sudden jolt behind her composed exterior. On occasion, yes. Why do you ask? Poirot produced a worn and torn playing card from his pocket, its edges ragged, the face partially faded, yet unmistakably the king of diamonds. Might this belong to you? Her face remained a mask of thoughtful neutrality, but the silence she allowed to grow between them said more than her words. I have a deck, she said finally, in my cabin, but I haven't played since we left port. Would you mind if we had a look? Poirot asked, already certain of the answer. She led them through a narrow corridor to her cabin, a tidy, almost austere space steeped in academia, the air scented faintly with dust and ink, shelves lined with battered volumes on Cycladic ruins and Mycenaean rites, and a gleaming statue of Hecate stood like a sentry over a desk strewn with handwritten notes. From the bottom drawer she retrieved a deck of cards and handed it to him without resistance. Poirot spread them methodically across the desk. 51 cards. The king of diamonds was missing. Curious, he murmured. Dracul frowned, her brow creasing. I hadn't noticed, truly. And yet half of this card, he said, holding up the torn piece like a damning relic, was discovered in Colonel Halbert's cabin. A flush crept slowly up her neck, her gaze faltering for the first time. We did speak, yesterday on deck. He approached me, rather aggressively. I didn't invite it, and I certainly didn't give him a card. If he took one, it was without my knowing. Her tone wavered, a subtle war between indignation and dread. As we exited into the corridor, now dimly lit and swaying with the pulse of the sea, I turned to Poirot, troubled by the encounter. You don't believe her, do you? I asked. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes remained sharp and distant, as though studying something only he could perceive. The truth, Hastings, he said quietly, is like a relic buried for centuries, coated in lies, distorted by time, guarded by pride. But it is there, beneath the sediment, waiting to be unearthed. A low chime echoed from the ship's brass bell, 3 solemn strikes that marked not just the passage of time, but a deepening sense of dread. Outside, the sea slammed against the glass like a warning. Time was unraveling fast, and with every minute that passed, the mystery aboard the Erebus grew darker, more twisted, and infinitely more dangerous. Outside, the storm had begun to show its true fury, the sea crashing violently against the hull of the ship, each wave striking as though settling an old vendetta. Inside the cabin, everything trembled faintly, yet Poirot remained still as stone, his sharp eyes fixed on Barton with a calm intensity that cut deeper than any question. Barton, no longer the composed man he once was, now spoke with exhaustion laced in every word, shame hiding behind a veil of restrained bitterness. You wouldn't understand, he said quietly. I planned every inch of that operation, every contingency, every tactic, every outcome. But when the time came, only Radley's name stood in the reports. He received the commendation, the ceremony, the applause. And me? He laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. I was just a captain. He was a colonel. Who cared who actually led the mission? The papers bore his signature. He silenced me with rank and reputation. Poirot gave a slight nod, acknowledging the pain but clearly processing more than he revealed. You held on to this resentment for a long time, he said softly. Barton turned his gaze out to the raging sea, but there was no comfort in the chaos beyond. Poirot leaned in, voice calm yet cutting. There's a phrase, toll and glory. Does that mean anything to you? Barton flinched, a subtle jerk of the body, as if someone had stepped on a landmine buried deep inside him. Where did you hear that? He asked, startled. It's a crucial piece of our investigation, Poirot replied flatly. Barton's posture stiffened, then slumped in resignation. Yes, I wrote it. When I found out Radley was publishing his memoirs, I sent him a letter. I told him if he dared to take credit for my mission, I would expose everything. My men died out there, and he was trading their sacrifice for his fame. I wrote, "Your stolen glory will be your downfall," but he never replied. The years of silence had finally spilled into words, heavy and haunted. At that moment, the ship gave a sudden lurch, forcing Poirot to steady himself on the railing. "I believe, mon ami," he said, "this conversation would be better continued elsewhere." We followed Poirot to the smoking room, half full, dimly lit, and reeking faintly of tobacco and salt air. I leaned toward him, lowering my voice. So Barton had a motive. The phrase "stolen glories" matches the threat note the steward described. Poirot nodded slowly. But think, if he meant to kill Radley, why wait until now? Why not when the wound was still fresh? Before I could respond, a steward arrived with a silver tray. "Message for Monsieur Poirot," he said. Poirot unfolded the note, read it quickly, then stood. "The captain wants to see us. He says there's been a discovery." We returned to Barton's cabin, where the captain and first officer stood tense. Barton looked confused, even a little afraid. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You had no right." The captain turned to us. "Despite the murder, we've continued routine checks. In Barton's drawer, we found this." He held up a page, a draft of the same threat note, the exact words, "Stolen glory." Poirot took the page and read aloud. "Your stolen glory will be your downfall. Every man receives justice." Barton flushed deep red. "Yes, I wrote that, but I never sent it. I wrote it the night I saw him again. I was furious, but I changed my mind and tucked it away in the desk." Poirot studied him intently. "Where were you yesterday between 4 and 5 p.m.? Barton hesitated. "At the gym, then on deck." "Anyone who saw you?" asked the captain. "The gym attendant." "Yes, but I was alone on deck." The captain's voice turned grim. "That's when someone was seen leaving Colonel Radley's cabin." Barton paled. "This is absurd. I didn't go anywhere near the first-class cabins." Poirot asked, "Were you aware of Colonel Radley's ancient coin collection?" "No, I already told you, but one coin is missing. A rare Alexandrian tetradrach." Barton gave a dry, bitter laugh. "Search my cabin. Tear it apart. You won't find anything." "You won't find any ancient coin," Barton said coolly, his voice carrying a stubborn finality. But there was something in the rigidity of his posture, too still, too rehearsed, that made Poirot glance at him with that familiar piercing gaze. The captain gave a silent nod to his first officer, who immediately began a meticulous and silent inspection of the cabin. Every drawer was opened and every compartment combed with the precision of a surgeon. Clothes were unfolded and shaken, the mattress lifted from its frame, shoes turned upside down, the floorboards lightly tapped and the lining of a suitcase examined for tampering. The officer even ran his hand along the inside edge of a painting frame and checked behind the mirror, as if suspecting a hidden compartment. Barton stood stiffly by the porthole, arms crossed, gaze locked on the sea, though the occasional twitch of his jaw betrayed the tension brewing beneath his composed facade. Finally the officer exhaled and turned. "Nothing, sir," he reported, stepping back with the deference of a man baffled by the absence of what he expected to find. A flicker of disappointment crossed Poirot's usually controlled face, and as we stepped out into the corridor, the creaking ship seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. "You appear disheartened," I remarked, watching Poirot's expression. "Non, mon ami," he replied softly, "not disheartened, merely intrigued. When the clues refuse to fit, it is often not the fault of the pieces, but of the puzzle itself. Perhaps we are trying to assemble the wrong image altogether." Just then, a young officer approached briskly, saluting with the kind of formality that suggested urgency. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the captain has asked me to inform you that we will reach Malta in less than 2 hours. The local authorities have been alerted and will board as soon as we dock." Poirot nodded with calm efficiency, but I could see it. the subtle acceleration of his thoughts. The window to uncover the truth was closing fast, and though the facts lay scattered before us, the final picture remained frustratingly out of focus. Hawkins, Poirot muttered suddenly. We must find the steward. I have reason to believe his role in this affair may be far more central than he realizes. We made our way swiftly through the ship's narrowing passageways, now quieter than before as we had moved into calmer waters. The rocking had lessened, and the occasional sound of utensils or laughter from distant dining rooms felt oddly out of place amid the tension curling in the air around us. Guided by the purser, we descended into the crew levels, where the walls were metal and utilitarian, humming with the quiet energy of unseen engines. We found Hawkins in the linen room, standing behind a table stacked with neatly folded sheets and towels, everything arranged with shipboard precision. He was mid-task, checking off items on a clipboard, when he looked up and froze for half a second too long. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, he said, voice tightening ever so slightly. Can I help you? Poirot's eyes flicked over the pristine shelves before him, and he ran a finger along one, as if inspecting not just for dust, but for honesty. You were in charge of cabins 9 through 15. Yes, sir, Hawkins said carefully. That included Colonel Radley's cabin. It did, sir. I moved his belongings to cabin 13, when the reassignment came through. All of them? Well, not exactly. The colonel handled his valuables himself. I wasn't to touch those. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Did he mention what those valuables were? No, sir, but I did see him carrying a small leather case from the safe in his old cabin, about the size of a document folder. Looked like it had some weight to it. The ancient coins, I whispered to Poirot. When did you complete the transfer? Poirot continued, eyes fixed on Hawkins' face. I began after dinner, around 8 o'clock. I'd say I was mostly finished by 8:45, but the colonel asked for his formal attire to be pressed for the next evening. I took those down to laundry, and brought them back to the new cabin at about 9:30. Poirot nodded. Which is when you encountered us on deck, asking for the time. Exactly. My watch had stopped at 9:15. Inconvenient timing, that. And when you returned to cabin 13 later, it was approximately 10:15, sir. I'd finished my other rounds and wanted to make sure everything was in place. Did you notice anything unusual? Hawkins hesitated, then frowned. Actually, yes. There were a few drops of water on the corridor floor near the cabin. I figured someone had spilled a drink, maybe from the bar. I wiped it up before knocking. Poirot's eyes gleamed, a light flashing behind them like the sudden illumination of a dark corridor. Water, he murmured. Ah, that is very interesting. Most interesting. Is it, sir? Hawkins asked, confused. Poirot didn't answer. His gaze had gone distant again, as if some invisible thread had just been pulled taut in his mind, binding the scattered pieces of this puzzle together. Tell me, he said slowly. How well did you know Colonel Radley's personal habits? Not well at all, sir. This was only day 3 of the voyage. Poirot remained quiet for a moment longer, and I recognized that look. His mind was racing ahead of ours, dancing somewhere in the shadows of the facts we thought we understood. Something had shifted. Something hidden had just moved into the light, and though I didn't yet know what it was, I knew Poirot had seen it. The secret behind cabin 13 was no longer safely buried. It was surfacing. Hawkins' quarters were unnaturally immaculate. Every button gleamed, every fold crisp, and every uniform hung with a precision that suggested either strict discipline or deep-seated fear. There was a tremor in his hands, nearly imperceptible, as he subtly adjusted his sleeve and said, I serve every guest with equal attention, sir. No preferences. But his tone betrayed a flicker of unease, like someone who's heard a knock on the locked door of a buried secret. I leaned in slightly. Yet some guests, I said quietly, seem to have received more personalized service. Colonel Radley's military decorations, those weren't just arranged, they were placed in precise order of precedence. For a heartbeat, Hawkins's expression drained of color, a flash of recognition flickering behind his eyes. You noticed, sir. I notice more than I say, I replied. Only someone with military experience could have arranged them like that. Did you serve Hawkins? His body stiffened instinctively, like muscle memory from old drills. Yes, sir. Royal Army Service Corps. Nothing remarkable, logistics and supply. Did you serve under Colonel Radley? I asked. His jaw tensed, and he looked down. No sir, different sector. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't truth either. Yesterday, around the time of the incident, did you see anyone near cabin 13, who shouldn't have been there? He hesitated, voice lowered. Sir, I don't want to sound improper. It's a murder investigation, I said. And what's often considered improper, can turn out to be vital. He swallowed hard, then leaned in. I saw Lady Westbrook, sir, around 4 p.m. She said she'd lost her cabin, but hers is on the upper deck. You're sure about the time? Yes, sir. I was delivering Miss Papadopoulos's afternoon tea. I noted the detail, and we made our way back upstairs. I glanced at PUO. Lady Westbrook has been a quiet name in this investigation, perhaps too quiet, or someone wanted her to stay that way, PUO replied, his tone sharper. But the real question is, why would an aristocratic woman, claiming to have met the colonel for the first time, lie about their past, unless she already knew him? In the ship's library, we found Miss Lemon closing her notepad, adjusting her glasses with calm precision. Mr. PUO, she began. Mrs. Radley made a 3-minute phone call yesterday afternoon from Athens, spoken in Greek. PUO raised an eyebrow. And the second point? According to the travel records, she continued, Lady Westbrook and Colonel Radley sailed together 6 months ago aboard the Alexandria Star. PUO's eyes lit up. So this wasn't their first meeting. There's a backstory someone deliberately buried. Just then an officer hurried in, breathless. Captain requests your presence immediately, sir. A steward was caught throwing something overboard. In the captain's cabin a white handkerchief lay on the table, a worn coin placed carefully at its center. The ancient face of a forgotten ruler stared upward, faded but dignified. Found on Vincent Hawkins, the captain said. He claims someone planted it in his pocket, discovered it while changing uniforms and panicked. PUO leaned closer, examining it without touching. A tetradrachm, rare and extremely valuable. Then we've found our thief, I murmured. And possibly our killer. PUO shook his head. No, we've just uncovered another puzzle piece, but I fear someone's assembling these pieces in just the right way, to form a false picture. As we stepped out onto the deck, the mist was lifting, revealing the rugged coast of Malta in the distance, land emerging from the deception of sea and fog. Time was slipping away, but from the quiet resolve in PUO's eyes, I could sense the truth behind cabin 13 was now dangerously close, and perhaps far more deadly than any of us had imagined. The golden haze of late afternoon slanted across the deck like a silent promise, casting long shadows that stretched toward the sea as Malta's coastline shimmered on the distant horizon, tranquil and beautiful, as though daring us to forget that a storm of secrets churned just beneath the calm. With perhaps an hour left before docking, most passengers had retreated to tea or their cabins, yet PUO remained as still as the horizon, his sharp mind working behind that unreadable expression. Rather than chase the obvious, he insisted we call upon Lady Westbrook, a name that had lingered on the fringes of our inquiry like a fading perfume, too refined to arouse suspicion, too polished to be questioned early. We found her precisely where one might expect, reclining in the opulent first-class lounge, surrounded by delicate china, rich upholstery and an air of silent superiority. She was every inch the portrait of aristocracy, adorned with shimmering diamonds that caught the sunlight with each elegant flick of her wrist. As we approached, she placed her teacup on its saucer with such practiced grace that even the sound of porcelain meeting porcelain felt choreographed. Monsieur PUO, she said coolly, her accent as crisp as winter air. I was beginning to think I'd escaped your scrutiny entirely. Her smile didn't touch her eyes. Everyone else has been questioned, I understand. PUO bowed faintly, his voice calm. I regret the delay, Lady Westbrook. I find it's often most revealing to save the best for last. She gestured toward the velvet chairs beside her. As we sat, a whisper of an oriental cologne curled in the air, velvety, exotic and unmistakably deliberate. PUO's eyes lingered on her with measured interest. You were acquainted with Colonel Radley prior to this voyage, I believe. Her fingers adjusted the pearls at her throat, an unconscious gesture perhaps, or maybe not. Yes, we met during a crossing to Egypt 6 months ago. We dined once or twice. Courteous, formal, hardly an intimacy. And yet, Puo said softly, you expressed particular fascination with his ceremonial dagger at dinner 2 nights ago. I appreciate craftsmanship, she replied smoothly. My late husband was a collector of rare artifacts, including coins perhaps, he inquired. Her pause was microscopic, but Puo caught it. I wasn't aware the colonel collected coins, she replied. Voice clipped. Curious, Puo murmured. Especially since you were seen by Steward Hawkins near cabin 13 yesterday afternoon. The teacup froze mid-air. I became disoriented, she said, returning the cup to the saucer with a distinct click. These modern ships are labyrinths. I took a wrong turn. After 3 full days aboard. Puo raised a brow. Yet the purser's log shows you've sailed frequently. Color rose faintly under her powdered cheeks. If you must know, I intended to show the colonel a brooch, an antique scarab set in gold and lapis. He expressed interest. I preferred privacy over spectacle. At 4 o'clock, Puo said, when most first-class passengers were at tea. Some transactions are better kept discreet, monsieur. She smirked, then added, I suppose that looks suspicious now. Everything does, Lady Westbrook, in the absence of truth. Puo's gaze sharpened. May I ask about your perfume? It lingers, subtly, but distinctly. Her hand drifted to her throat. Midnight in Cairo. A rare blend bought during my last visit. You find it pleasant? It is unforgettable, Puo said, then stood. We thank you. One final matter awaits before we dock. As we left the lounge, I leaned toward him. The cologne, significant. His voice dropped. Deeply. I detected the same scent, faint, almost hidden in cabin 13 last night. Before I could digest the implication, Miss Lemon appeared with careful urgency, holding a handkerchief-wrapped item. Monsieur Puo, as you requested the colonel's pocket watch. It was among his personal effects, secured with the purser. Puo unwrapped it reverently, revealing a fine hunter-case timepiece, its gold surface warm with age and worth. He studied the dial, his eyes narrowing. Hastings, tell me, what do you see? I leaned closer. It stopped at 9:22. A shadow passed over Puo's face. And yet, Hawkins reported that his own watch had stopped at 9:15, and said the current time was 9:27. You think the time matters? I asked. Puo's voice was barely more than a breath. I know it does, because within those 12 invisible minutes, a life ended with precision. And now, it's not the watch that's broken. It's the truth that's been wound back, concealed under layers of civility, perfume, and polished lies. As the SS Caledonia neared the glowing coast of Malta, the low thrum of the engines seemed to echo the tension mounting in every corridor of the ship, a strange, unnatural stillness settling like a fog just before revelation. I carefully rewrapped the colonel's watch, noting again how its hands had frozen at 1:17 a.m., the faint scent of cologne still ghosting over the metal, as if time itself had inhaled the final breath of a dying man. Those droplets Hawkins had seen near cabin 13, scattered like teardrops on the polished floor, no longer seemed like an accident. They were a breadcrumb trail the killer had tried to mop away, but which, under the scrutiny of Puo's gaze, had remained defiantly in place. We made our way to the captain's cabin, where Captain Barton and the first officer, faces tight with urgency, were flipping through thick sheafs of paperwork, preparing for the questions they knew were moments away. Monsieur Puo, the captain said sharply, the local authorities will board the moment we dock. Please tell me you have answers for them. Puo's eyes, calm yet blazing with internal deduction, met his evenly. Answers, yes, but first, clarity. He requested to see once more the full inventory of the deceased colonel's belongings. As he scanned the list, his finger came to rest, motionless, on one seemingly innocuous lined shaving kit. It contained a straight razor, he asked. His voice, quiet but pointed, silver-handled, engraved with his initials, the captain confirmed. A rather fine piece. And the ceremonial dagger? Puo inquired, a dark current in his tone. Was it thoroughly examined? The doctor says the fatal blow was a precise strike to the heart. Entered between the ribs with surgical force. Fingerprints? Puo asked without looking up. None. The hilt was spotless. Puo pressed his lips together, then nodded, his mind racing behind still eyes. I must speak to Mrs. Radley again. Alone. We found her in her cabin, her behavior a masterclass in restraint, folding clothes with emotionless precision, everything in perfect order, too perfect. Madame, Puo began gently, forgive the intrusion, but time is not our ally. She didn't stop her packing. The Maltese police will want to question me, I assume. I have nothing to conceal. Puo smiled politely. Then allow me a small curiosity. You made a call to Athens yesterday. In Greek. She paused, a blouse half folded in her hands, then resumed, a fraction too smoothly. I have friends there. I told you this. And your connection to Miss Papadopoulos. Puo pressed, her mouth tightened. We're not connected. We merely speak the same language. Yet share no words, Puo noted with a flick of irony. Coincidences abound, madame. They do, she replied coldly. Sometimes that is all they are. Puo nodded, accepting the lie for now. One last detail. Do you know if your husband kept his cabin key with him at all times? She exhaled slowly, almost tired of the game. Such things were beneath my notice. He handled his affairs. I handled mine. As we exited, the low vibration of the engines deepened. The shoreline was close now, the ancient Maltese port spreading out ahead, bathed in golden light like a city waiting for judgment. I turned to Puo, voice low. Time's up, my friend. Shouldn't you be preparing your statement for the authorities? He gave a small smile, that enigmatic curve of his lips that always meant he saw what others did not. Soon, mon ami. But first, one final test. Bring Miss Lemon to cabin 13 in 10 minutes. When we arrived, Puo was already inside, crouched beside the washstand, inspecting it with monastic focus. Not a detail escaped his attention. Every groove in the wood, every droplet pattern, every angle of reflection in the porthole. Good, he said without looking up. At precisely 6, I've requested all suspects to be present in the main lounge. It is there, beneath the chandeliers and velvet upholstery, that the truth will finally stand exposed, naked and undeniable. So you've solved it? I asked, heart pounding. Puo stood, straightening his bow tie with slow deliberation. I have begun to hear the story the evidence tells. The droplets on the floor, they should not have been there. The scent of cologne, it came from a place where it should not have lingered. The watch, why stop precisely, then if not to create an illusion? And the key? Ah, Hastings, the key. It was not where it should be unless someone wanted us to believe something untrue. He turned to the porthole, through which Malta's golden harbor now gleamed, calm and ancient and filled with watching eyes. The murderer, Puo whispered, spun a tale of silence and shadows. But they forgot one thing. Truth, mon ami, always leaves a trace. And tonight, we shall follow that trace to the bitter end. The drawing room was cloaked in a hush so thick it seemed to wrap around each person like a wet cloth, suffocating and inescapable. The air vibrated with a tension that refused to break, even as the steady hum of the ship's slowing engines signaled their creeping arrival into the port. Inspector Farrow, his presence as calm and calculating as a coiled serpent, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping the anxious faces assembled before him, each passenger a suspect, each glance a possible lie. He cleared his throat gently, but the sound sliced through the silence like a scalpel. Before I unravel the intricate web surrounding Major Holloway's death, he began, his voice cold, clipped, but brimming with restrained fire, I must confirm one final essential detail. His eyes locked onto the widow, Mrs. Holloway, seated upright with an unnatural stillness, her black mourning garments pristine, her gloved hands folded with mechanical precision in her lap. Madam, he said slowly, when was the last time you saw your husband alive? She didn't blink. Her hands shifted, smoothing an invisible crease on her already flawless skirt, her voice measured but lacking warmth. At dinner, she replied. I had a migraine and excused myself early. He remained in the lounge. Farrow tilted his head, reading her not just with his eyes but with the quiet scrutiny of a man trained to detect the tremor beneath the truth. You did not return to cabin 14 at any point that evening? He asked, casually, though the weight of the question hung like a blade. Certainly not, she replied, too quickly, her voice steady, but betraying the faintest tension around her eyes. As I've said, I took a sedative and retired. Farrow offered a polite nod, though his mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, pivoting sharply toward the steward. Mr. Lyle, when you discovered the Major's body, where exactly was the cabin key? The steward faltered for a split second, caught off guard. On the bedside table, sir, he said. I almost knocked it off when I leaned in to check his pulse. So Farrow pressed. Not in the lock, not hanging on the hook by the door. No, sir. Inside the room. Definitely. Farrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as if a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. He turned to his assistant, Miss Carlyle, who had already anticipated the next move and was thumbing through her notebook. Ensign Jonathan Blair, she began crisply, age 27, assigned to intelligence coordination in Tangiers, seen frequently in prolonged conversations with Mrs. Holloway during the voyage. The room, as if synchronized, turned toward the widow whose complexion had lost its poise, a faint but unmistakable paleness settling beneath the powder. He's a relative, she offered, her voice strained now. A distant cousin. We simply spoke often out of familiarity. Farrow gave a soft skeptical hum. That's not how the deck steward remembers it. On the second evening, before you knew you were being observed, the ensign reportedly brushed your hand, leaned in closely, and whispered something to the effect of, You're not alone in this. Her expression cracked, just a hairline fracture, but one that didn't escape Farrow's gaze. He didn't linger, turning now toward Dr. Salima Navarro, the quiet archaeologist who had previously insisted her interactions with the Major were purely academic. The torn parchment map found in the Major's cabin, Farrow said. You claimed he borrowed it during a brief encounter. Yes, she replied calmly. He seemed fascinated by it. Odd then, Farrow said smoothly, that the tear was precise and clean, straight down the middle, as though prepared for deliberate concealment. And odder still that, during a search of your cabin desk, I found trace amounts of bonding resin, an adhesive uniquely used in the preservation of ancient scrolls. The very same resin found on the map's edges, and curiously, on the smuggled coin discovered hidden in the steward's possessions. Navarro's shoulders stiffened, but her tone remained measured. I work with such materials daily. That proves nothing. In isolation, Farrow agreed. But nothing about this case exists in isolation. He turned to address the room in full, his voice rising just enough to seize every ear, every heartbeat. The death of Major Holloway was not born of impulse or misjudgment. It was a symphony of deceit, performed with calculated precision to manipulate our understanding of time and motive. Outside, the ship glided into the harbor's embrace, its engines exhaling a final breath as uniformed officials gathered on the dock below. The Major's shattered pocket watch, frozen at 9:26, was planted, timed to mislead, to establish a false moment of death. But remember earlier, Farrow continued, his gaze returning to Lyle. Your own watch stopped at 9:10, did it not? And when you asked me the time, I told you it was 9:24. That discrepancy is the key. It reveals the truth we missed. Captain Wren leaned forward, tension etched into every line of his face. You're suggesting he was killed earlier? Exactly, Farrow replied with quiet finality. Much earlier, before dinner, before the sedative, before the ensign's carefully crafted alibi. The condensation spotted outside cabin 14, misinterpreted as evidence of a body cooling, was merely water deliberately spilled to sell a lie. The truth is far more chilling. The Major was silenced before supper, giving our murderer ample time to reposition the scene, adjust the clock, and disappear into the night's shadow with no one the wiser. But as always, he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, time, though fragile, never lies. It only waits for someone clever enough to listen. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed. No one moved. Outside, the ship moored quietly as the trap closed, not with a bang, but with the patient ticking of a truth that had finally caught up. As the last echo of retreating footsteps dissolved into silence, a dense stillness fell over the luxurious vessel, broken only by the distant hum of machinery, and the strained breathing of those left behind. Inspector Daston Alvey stood unmoving, his expression carved from stone, eyes glinting with the weight of a truth too heavy for the room to yet bear. "The murderer," he began, his voice low, deliberate, yet slicing through the silence like a blade, "attempted to mislead us with an old but clever deception. The body was placed near a source of condensation, an ice bucket positioned just so, to manipulate the cooling rate and create the illusion of a later time of death." Several faces turned pale. A chair creaked. Eleanor Ward, draped in black silk and carefully composed grief, instinctively brought her gloved hand to her throat. "Surely you don't mean," she began. But Alvey's gaze was unrelenting. "I mean precisely what the evidence dictates," he said. "When I examined Colonel Whitaker's effects, one detail struck me as profoundly out of place. His shaving mug, nestled beside a dry brush and unused towel, contained soap that was utterly hardened. No moisture, no scent, and yet we were told he shaved that very morning. Curious, wouldn't you agree? It was a clue left not by carelessness but by circumstance, a sliver of truth in a sea of lies." The room's temperature seemed to drop as the inspector continued, each word falling heavier than the last. "The colonel did not die in cabin 14 as claimed. No, he perished hours earlier, likely between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and in his original cabin, number 7. The body was moved under the calculated pretense of an evening cabin change, during dinner service, when the ship's corridors were momentarily still, and prying eyes were few. His belongings followed, moved like props in a tragic performance, but even the most artful staging leaves behind its flaws." He turned then, his gaze narrowing. "The key, the key was our greatest witness, found inside the locked cabin. If the killer had ambushed him, the key would remain outside. But it wasn't. The door had been locked from within. That can mean only one thing. The colonel knew his killer, and invited them in." A hushed tension gripped the room like a vice. Alvey's voice softened, but it lost none of its power. There was a scent in that room, a perfume neither subtle nor accidental. Midnight in Alexandria, rare, potent, and not something the colonel ever wore. His valet confirmed this with certainty. But someone else aboard favors it, someone close, too close. Eleanor's composure cracked as Alvey turned back to her, her eyes wide, shimmering with dread. "The one who aided you," he said, voice almost mournful, "wore that scent. The accomplice who helped move the body, plant the false trail, and nearly shifted blame onto the innocent. The person with whom you conspired, not just to deceive us, but to escape into a new life, one funded by the colonel's considerable fortune." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, cutting through her powdered face. She trembled. Her voice emerged as a whisper, raw and exposed. "It wasn't meant to be like this," she confessed. "Harold found my letters. He confronted me, threatened to destroy everything. Said he'd strip me from his will. He got violent. I panicked. I only wanted to protect myself." Her knees buckled slightly as she wept, the illusion of elegance collapsing beneath the weight of truth. At that moment, the ship gave a low shudder, docking. Outside the portholes, uniformed officers stood waiting, but Alvey remained still, unblinking. "We're not finished," he said quietly. "The full truth awaits in cabin 7. There amidst the real scene of the crime, every hidden thread will unravel." Wordlessly, the suspects followed him, a solemn procession of fractured dignity. Captain Duvall walked with rigid formality, though his clenched jaw betrayed rising fear. Miss Moreau, eyes twitching with panic, trailed behind, while Lady Westbrook glided like an icy spectre, her diamonds flashing coldly in the dim hallway light. Bringing up the rear was Simon Graves, Eleanor's rumoured lover, his knuckles white as he grasped the railing. Cabin 7 stood preserved, a time capsule of death. Alvy stepped inside and faced them all. This, he said slowly, is no longer a question of who wielded the weapon. It is about why, and who else helped bury the truth. His gaze moved from face to face. Deceit, he whispered, breeds in shadows, but shadows always retreat when faced with flame. And now, one final ember of revelation waited to ignite. As the storm outside battered the ship with relentless force, and thunder rolled like a warning from the heavens themselves, Inspector Rehan Vora's voice sliced through the suffocating silence inside the drawing room like a scalpel through silk. Mrs. Arya Haldon has indeed confessed to the killing of her husband, he said, eyes narrowed with calculating intensity. But what she presented as a moment of frantic self-defense is, in truth, the final move in a long brewing game of deception, greed, and betrayal that stretches back months, perhaps even years. A collective breath hitched among the passengers. Arya's trembling hands folded in her lap, her gaze cast downward, but her eyes shimmered with something far more complex than guilt, something rehearsed. The murder occurred not in a fit of panic as she claimed, but in the late afternoon, precisely between 4:15 and 4:40. Vora continued, pacing like a predator. And it was no solitary act. She had help. Murmurs surged like a current, but Vora raised a single gloved hand. Let us dissect the theater of deceit we've been fed. A threatening letter, supposedly written by the Colonel's old rival, conveniently placed to frame Captain Elias. A rare sovereign coin, missing for days, found in the satchel of the ship's steward, a man with no motive but every reason to be nervous, and the torn tarot card from a game no one recalls playing, linking Miss Ivana Kasparov to a crime she couldn't have committed. Each prop, each clue, planted, precisely, methodically. The air grew heavier. Lady Eloan Northbridge adjusted her emerald brooch with icy poise. "What are you implying, Inspector?" she asked, her voice brittle. "You said she confessed." Vora turned, eyes glinting. "She confessed, partially, selectively, enough to earn your sympathy, not enough to reveal the rot beneath." He took a step forward. "She claimed her husband struck her, yet the post-mortem reveals no bruises, no marks on her, and more tellingly, no defensive wounds on the Colonel. He didn't fight. He didn't expect danger. Why? Because he trusted the person who plunged the blade into his heart." Arya's lip trembled. "I never said he hit me," she whispered. "You didn't have to," Vora countered coldly. "You implied it just as you implied that Commander Rafe Wren was your protector, your secret lover. But it wasn't him, was it?" Vora's gaze shifted slowly, dangerously toward Lady Northbridge. "It was you, Eloan, or should I say the shadow behind the perfume, Wild Iris of Vienna, found lingering on the Colonel's pillowcase. Not his scent, not Arya's, but yours." The color drained from Lady Northbridge's face. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" Vora interrupted sharply. The Colonel's ledger hidden in his private compartment detailed all his acquisitions during the voyage: ancient coins, precious stones, and a transaction marked TN for a stolen relic, a silver jackal statuette from Luxor. He paid handsomely, but he had discovered the truth: the piece was counterfeit, and he had already begun legal proceedings. And who handled that deal? You, Lady Northbridge, under a false identity. He was going to expose you. Arya's eyes widened. "Eloan, you told me you'd fixed it, that he'd just leave quietly." "She lied," Vora cut in. "The plan was simple: kill the Colonel before he could speak, frame others with scattered evidence, and then disappear with his assets, split between the widow and the swindler. But what exposed them wasn't blood, or bruises or screams, it was the key." He pointed to the small bronze key placed neatly on the nightstand. The cabin was locked from outside, yet the key remained inside. Only one other existed, with someone the Colonel trusted enough to leave it with. His wife. She passed it to Lady Northbridge. She locked the door after planting the evidence and returned unnoticed. But shadows lie poorly in light, and now that light has found them. As the ship neared port, the clouds above finally began to part, but inside that room, the storm had just begun. The silence in the drawing room shattered as Chief Inspector Marchand stepped forward, his voice low but ironclad with finality. "You're saying this entire crime was the result of a partnership?" "Not just a partnership," Detective Ilara Voss corrected, her gaze sweeping the frozen faces before her, a carefully choreographed deception between two women, masked behind layers of grief, propriety, and misdirection. Gasps rippled through the room as she stepped toward the ornate fireplace, eyes fixed on the flickering embers as if they held the final truth. Mrs. Bellamy lured her husband to the observatory wing under the pretense of a reconciliatory conversation, she continued, where Miss Darcy was already waiting, hidden in the alcove, the ceremonial dagger from the Maharaja's collection clutched in her gloved hands. Together, they struck, swift, silent, and without hesitation. All eyes turned to Miss Darcy, whose previously impassive expression cracked as her voice rose, trembling with emotion. She said he was a monster, that he beat her, belittled her, that no court would convict a grieving widow. She promised we'd start anew, take the inheritance and disappear into Morocco. Mrs. Bellamy's jaw tightened, but the betrayal burned hot in her eyes. "You swore we'd be safe," she spat. "You said no one would ever uncover the truth." "And they wouldn't have," Ilara interjected calmly. "If not for the burnt parchment remnants in the fireplace, portions of the Colonel's travel log, detailing the very dagger as part of an incoming donation to the Museum of Antiquities. You didn't know he'd made copies." The room went still. The melted frost near the terrace door, the smeared shoe print in the crimson rug, those tiny overlooked elements told a story you never meant to be read. In a sudden jarring motion, Miss Darcy darted toward the antique writing desk, where Voss had earlier placed the now blunted letter opener, her scream more animal than human, as she lunged. Voss didn't flinch. I instinctively leapt between them, the sharp sting slicing through my shoulder as the blade grazed flesh. Blood darkened my sleeve, but the officers were already upon her, dragging her away as she shrieked curses and promises of vengeance. Mrs. Bellamy stood silent, trembling as iron cuffs clasped her wrists.
"It's over,"
Voss said softly, dabbing my wound with a monogrammed handkerchief, her touch steady. "A shallow wound," I muttered, wincing. "Much shallower than the lies they tried to bury us under." The inspector, still stunned, whispered, "But how did you know? What made you certain it was the two of them?" Voss smiled faintly, brushing soot from her gloves. "Intuition perhaps, but more than that, those small quiet clues. The misplaced timepieces, the extinguished lantern, the exotic perfume that lingered where it should not have." She turned, eyes settling on the cracked frame of the murdered colonel's wedding portrait. "And the human heart, so desperate for freedom, yet so blind to the chains it wraps around others." As the paramedic wrapped my arm and the whispers of the stunned guests filled the corridor, I found myself staring down the hall toward the guest wing, toward room 27, the very room Bellamy insisted on avoiding due to her superstitions about its past. And yet, had she embraced its presence, her husband might never have been lured to that isolated wing. In the end, the number she feared most hadn't damned her, but it had marked the beginning of a series of small miscalculations that would unravel her perfect crime. For her, and her lover-turned-betrayer, it would not be the freedom of Casablanca or the inheritance of secrets that awaited, but the cold, echoing cells of a far less forgiving future.